You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Feel like who art Ed?
We'll try to spice it.
Who art Ed? Mr. Wood art Ed me.
Good. Either way, it's ambiguous. It works on so many levels.
I know.
That's off to a great start.
Welcome to Who Arted, where we explore visual arts in an audio medium. I'm your host, Kyle Wood. Today, we are about halfway through the Arts Madness tournament, and after 3 rounds, some of the heavy hitters have been knocked out. Round 3 seemed to be the time when a lot of the traditional old favorites were making a resurgence. I saw Andy Warhol knocked out friend of the pod, Joe Mills. Andy Warhol, the pop art icon and trailblazer, knocked out the contemporary artist, Joe Mills. Leonardo da Vinci was just barely able to edge out Homer Simpson. Those two came within about 80 votes of each other, but of course, in the end, Leonardo da Vinci came out on top. Stuart Semple is still hanging strong. After 3 rounds, he is now facing probably the stiffest competition he's had so far. Stuart Semple is up against Leonardo da Vinci in round 4, and I would say if Semple pulls out the victory on this one, he's got a good chance of winning it all. Now, one of the other matchups in round 4 is Katsushika Hokusai up against Sharuvi Agrawal. Hokusai was, of course, one of the most famous Japanese woodcut artists of the 19th century. And we have his Great Wave off Kanagawa. It was part of his series of different views of Mount Fuji. Now, the Great Wave off Kanagawa is up against Sharuvi Agrawal's 26,000 Bells of Hanuman. Agrawal is an Indian artist, and she created the sculpture of Hanuman, the Hindu deity, out of 26,000 bells, so that it is a sculpture that is not only visually stunning, but also has an auditory element. The bell in the Hindu faith is typically used to sort of ring when one enters into the temple as a way of alerting the deity to one's presence. And of course, that makes for a really interesting connection as she is making the deity out of the bells. I would encourage listeners to listen to that old episode to learn a little bit more. You can find the Agrawal episode, just like all of the others, on the website, as well as linked in the brackets spreadsheet. Now, as I turn my attention to the other brackets, I see that in round 4, we have Duff Goldman up against Jim Dine. That, to me, is kind of an interesting mix, because really they're two such different artists. Duff Goldman is a culinary artist sculpting absolutely beautiful works out of cake, and Jim Dine is more of sort of a poppy contemporary painter, although he does work in other media. The specific piece we're looking at in this tournament is his confetti heart lithograph. But again, it's comparing apples and oranges, or really apples with something that aren't even food. It is cake versus a print. So I'll be curious to see how my students debate those pieces in the classroom and where people ultimately land on which is the better artist and which is the stronger work of art. And the final matchup I'm looking at here is Yayoi Kusama versus Andy Warhol. Now, Yayoi Kusama was last year's tournament winner, and she is probably one of the most prominent living artists on the scene today. She is, of course, the Japanese painter, sculptor, installation artist, poet. She really does a little bit of everything and does it shockingly well. We have her installation up against Andy Warhol's zebra print from his Endangered Species series. It's a tough matchup. Both of them are bright and bold and colorful and fun, have a little bit of a poppy sensibility to them. Both of them also have a little bit of a conceptual bent. Kusama's piece, of course, using visuals and installation art along with sound and poetry to to get people focused on how love is calling. Whereas Andy Warhol was using his time, his talents, and his prestige to raise awareness of the important issues of conservation and protecting our environment and the inhabitants of that environment. He made a series of prints calling attention to the plight of a number of endangered species, and this one is an absolutely beautiful print of the zebra. Now, as always, I would encourage you to please join in the fun of passing judgment on all of these different artists. Vote for your favorites in this week's matchups for Arts Madness. You can do that at the website www.whoartedpodcast.com. I also want to say a big thank you to all of you who have been voting in each week's matchups, and to all of my listeners. It has been really cool to see this podcast growing in audience over time, especially this last month. I am on track to get 10,000 downloads this month alone, and while I never really expected to have that large of an audience, I gotta say, it feels pretty good. Please tell your friends, like the show, follow, leave a review, help others discover it, and help me cross that threshold to 10,000 listeners this month. This concludes this week's episode of Who Arted. If you found this tolerable, please like and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you're listening. You can find images of the work being discussed this week and every week in the show notes, on Twitter @WoodArtEd, and on the website whoartedpodcast.com. Podcast done.